you could say, well, how do people on some of these vegans or more plant-based diets do it? Well, if you're eating a whole bunch of whole foods and you're getting enough sort of saturated fats, you can do okay. Because
if you're low enough fat, you're not taking any linoleic acid in, and a starch-based diet has its own method of saying to the fat cells that they're full. It's completely different to the system that the fats use. I won't go into it because we didn't want to go into molecular lumps and bumps and electrons here and there. But there is a satiety signal generated by a combination of insulin and glucose, which does very, very similar things to the signal which is generated by fatty acids if they're saturated compared to non-saturated. And because of energy production is not from one source or another, it's a completely integrated system. And if you mess up the fatty acid component of it, it will have a knock-on effect on the carbohydrate bit. So if you're on a very, very low fat vegan diet, you won't be healthy for a moment you would, but you won't be fat either, because you've got the carbohydrate and insulin, and those two in combination, there are biochemical quirks that they give a stop signal to the filling up of fat cells by a related method to the way that fats do. But when you have fats and carbohydrates, it's like an integrated circuit chip or a computer chip. It takes this input and that input, and the mitochondria, the energy producing cells, integrate what energy status the cell is at. And if you drop linoleic acid into the fatty part of it, it will also mess up the glucose part of it. At that point, then carbohydrates become intensely fattening. Yeah, because the carbohydrates pump up insulin, and your fatty acid composition has stopped the satiety signal for the cell. Then the carbohydrate will just make loads of insulin. And if you're amplifying the insulin signal or failing to limit the insulin signal, and the insulin signal is very low, you ain't going to notice that. But if the insulin signal's through the roof and you make it work better and better and better, then you're going to put a ton of fat on. But I think the vegans and the very low fat people get away with it because they're so low in absolute fat that the polyunsaturates are low as well. And that means that the integrated circuit that controls satiety still works as it should do.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
Hello, everyone. We're back for season 10 of the Peak Human podcast. I'm Brian Sanders. We took a little break. We went and filmed at some regenerative ranches for Food Lies. We got some amazing footage. Man, I cannot wait to get this movie out. We work on it every day. We have 2 new members on the team. I'm really excited. Things are going very well. We still don't have a release date, but just know it's going to be awesome. If you're new to this podcast, start back at episode 1. There's so much valuable information. This has been a whole journey as I make the film. You can learn from all the experts that I've interviewed. I've gotten some great feedback recently from listeners who have done just that. Started back at episode 1, changed their life, reversed disease, lost dozens of pounds, even up to 100 pounds. I love it. Message me on Instagram or wherever else. I'd love to hear your stories. Today's episode is with Peter from Hyperlipid, whose last name I will not try to say. He's super smart. He's one of these diamonds in the rough, an interesting guy doing really great work, digging into tons of studies, using his scientific background to come to some new conclusions, talking about things that people need to hear more about. Cutting edge stuff that he's seen in the research and many doctors agree with, some of which I've had on the show. Peter is a veterinarian who is trained at the Royal Veterinary College within London University. He is very well respected in the nutrition world for his blog, Hyperlipid, where he dives deep into the science behind what we should be eating. He goes into great detail on his blog, so definitely read that if you're interested. But for this episode, thankfully to many, we did not go into the insane details that he goes into, but just know he can. He knows this stuff so well. I told him, let's keep it high level. Let's not get into the weeds. Let's make this approachable and easy to understand for people. And I think we did just that. He asked a big question. Are medical professionals giving the absolutely wrong advice? Maybe the one thing they're telling you to do to replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats is a huge driver in chronic disease, in you overeating, in the health of your mitochondria. Listen to this one. It's long, but it is good. So before we start, quick mention of my company, Nose to Tail. It's how this whole thing works. It's why I can do this podcast without any sponsors for 132 episodes until now. I've added one, Redmond. I love Redmond. I bring them up every now and then. They have the best salt. They do a very natural toothpaste that I use. They have Relight, which is a electrolyte mix that I use on the weekends when I play beach volleyball. They are a perfect complement to Nose to Tail. We have all the grass-fed regenerative meat. We have the biltong. We have some body care products, and they have the rest. It's a match made in heaven. Use the code SAPIEN to get 15% off. That's SAPIEN, capital SAPIEN. Use that at checkout on redmond.life and get 15% off your order. They're a great sponsor. They've been sending me their awesome salt and their toothpaste for a while. I'm glad they're on board. You can also get the meat while you're online at nosetotatail.org. Primal ground beef, definitely a staple in my diet and should be everyone's diet. Get all the organs mixed into your ground beef. We got the biltong. We're making a new batch of the liver Drovors. Drovors is a stick version of the biltong, which everyone loves. That liver one will be coming back soon. Body care, almost running out of stock already. It's hard to keep up with production. This is made from regenerative beef tallow. It's whipped, it's light and fluffy. It's the best skin product I've ever used, and many people agree. We also have the seasonings. I love the Primal Special on any meat. Use the ranch every day, Dylan Ranch, every single day with my goat milk yogurt. So good. Add the Redmond salt, add the Dylan Ranch, mix it up, and it is the best. So nosetotatail.org, go to Redmond, use the code SAPIEN. And speaking of SAPIEN, you can go to sapien.org, become a member of the tribe, get all the bonus content, extended show notes. We're doing a Zoom call in a couple days. If you join now, you can join me on the Zoom call and we can hang out. It's really fun to just hang with people, talk, go over what we talked about in the podcast, share ideas. So that's about it for today. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sharing with a friend, giving it a review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. And now let's hear from Peter from Hyperlipid.
All right, we're good to go. Welcome, Peter. How are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, you are where and how do you say your last name?
Okay, I'm in the UK. I'm in East Anglia, which is Norfolk, which is about two hours drive outside of London, heading northeast. And you pronounce my surname Dobromylskyj. Dobromylskyj.
So
and
Petro or Peter Dobromylskyj.
Everybody's always called me Peter, but I got into problems as a teenager because I filled in various legal documents as Peter, and when you get my birth certificate out, it's Petro, and it's from Ukraine, and my father simply transliterated his name from Ukrainian to English, which is why it's full of Y's and J's and has very few vowels at all.
Well, we got it figured out. So my job here at the podcast and all the other things I do is find the most brilliant people around, all the people doing the cutting edge stuff with the new ideas. And sometimes those are doctors and nutrition people, but sometimes they're not, because sometimes those people are kind of caught up in the system that they, were schooled in. Yeah. So you are a veterinarian. Maybe you could tell us a little more about your background and what you're interested in.
Okay. I came up through London University in the 1970s. I qualified in 1981. And back in those days, education was free when you came from my background. And if you wrote a nice little handwritten note to your local authority where you came from, they saying, "Can I please have money to do an extra year?" They would give you a year off to do a year of extra funding to do a physiology degree as part of your veterinary degree. So you did the first 2 years. If you wanted a third year of physiology, you could elect to integrate a Bachelor of Science degree in physiology into your veterinary degree. It put you back by a year, but it was really, really interesting, and it appealed to me. And out of the 70 people in my year, 3 of us intercalated degrees. We all intercalated different degrees. We went to different departments. I went to University College Hospital to do pain stuff, and reproductive physiology at the Royal Veterinary College, and pharmacology at the Royal Veterinary College. So nothing was nutrition based, but it was science as opposed to medicine. And there's a massive difference between medicine and science, and there is overlap because there are odd bods like me, and there are the people who are looking at who've come from medicine primarily into low carb nutrition, who are looking more like scientists at the data rather than medics. And the medics, you're taught in certainly in vet school that you're going to go through what we used to call kicking out exams. If you didn't pass the exam, you were thrown out. And each year you'd have a set of kicking out exams. And unless you gave the people the answer that they wanted to hear, you were going to get thrown out. So you learned very, very quickly that you gave the right answer. And that went right through preclinical into clinical. And you learn very quickly that there's that you comply to what's required by the system to get your degree, and that's embedded very deep into clinicians.
Interesting.
Yeah.
A lot of this world is turning into you must comply with authorities to get by, but we won't talk about that.
Don't frighten me as much as anymore. I'm already frightened. It is very scary. Very, very scary.
Very scary. But back to the thing, you're talking about with the clinicians. You did mention that mostly the low carb world is the one doing the real science. And that's interesting because that's what I've seen is that when you kind of look at how all the biochemistry and everything works in the human body, you do start to realize, oh, wait, there's a different kind of metabolism out there, metabolism that I haven't really been taught, or there's kind of this conflicting information that people learn in medical school. And it's only when you understand the more fat-based metabolism do you start putting everything together, and everything kind of makes more sense.
Yeah, and the other thing you learned outside of being a clinician is you did things like journal clubs, where you would take a paper that was selected by either another group member or by your tutor, and you'd simply take it to pieces. You know, do you believe this? Do you like the results? Do you like the methods? And you would actually learn how to deconstruct a scientific paper. And we learned nothing like that in the clinical classes. There was no education in any way of how to really assess data. It was simply a matter of these are algorithms for working out what the problem is, and on you go and come up with the right answer. So the BSc degree was very much in terms of learn a bit of science and learn how science works rather than medicine.
Well, medicine, it seems more like a playbook of this is what to prescribe people, and you don't. You don't talk back. Like you said, you just do what you're told. And that people contact me all the time saying they're in nutrition school or medical school and they don't agree with the teachers at all, but they have to just go with it.
You have to, otherwise they're kicking out exams. You won't get through if you can preserve your ability to question things, that's fine. So that's really where I started from. Beyond that, back in the 1980s, I think I read John Yudkin's book, Pure, White and Deadly, which put me off of sugar in a fairly big way. So for the next 20 years, I kind of avoided bulk sugar. I didn't particularly avoid starches or anything like that, but I suppose we'll probably come back to the yays and nays of sugar eventually. But I, by random chance, because I happened to read, it was a book in the library. It's a very small library. We lived in the middle of nowhere. It was one of the ones there, and I thought, I'll give that a read. And read all sorts of interesting things from not having access to the internet. There was no internet, obviously, in those days. And that I think stood me in pretty good stead for the following 20 years up to the turn of the century, back when we got to 2000 and 2000 onwards. So nutritionally, I just followed the mainstream. I'd have been quite happy to believe that fat made you fat. I avoided sugar, and I happened to be very keen on exercise, again, purely on a random chance basis. before I went to university, I marathon raced kayaks to a national level, and obviously once I went to university and I stopped training 6 days a week, I'm afraid that all went by the board very quickly. But we still kayaked a lot, and I kayak surfed a lot as well, and I kept that going on and off through the years. And so I kind of vaguely stayed healthy, that I wasn't eating a lot of sugar. I didn't pay a huge amount of attention to butter versus polyunsaturates versus whatever else you might want to eat. But I think I missed some of the mistakes I could have made as a youngster, and I was lucky that I happened to enjoy exercise, and not for exercise's sake. I can't do going to the gym. That's it. Just I could go to the gym if it meant I was going to beat the kayak racing K2 that we were going to be pitched against in 5 days' time. I can go to the gym because that's going to get me to win the race. But to go to the gym because I just want to go to the gym, I could never do that. Nowadays, my only resistant exercise is climbing. We go bouldering. The whole family goes bouldering. The kids do, I do. And this is up to 15 feet free climbing on holes which are pitched to whatever grade you like. So there are dead easy ones and ones that basically they look like smudge marks on the wall you're supposed to climb up.
Wow.
So
that's really great. Yeah, that's very ancestral, right? Climbing up things.
It's very resistance based, very short term, and you, after an hour and a half you're completely knackered. And I can do that because it's a challenge. I can work out how I can improve what I'm trying to do on the wall, and it gives me feedback as to whether I've made the right decisions or not. And it doesn't produce a muscle-bound physique or anything like that, but I'm old now, and I'm perfectly strong enough to run fairly well. 66.
66? Yeah, you're looking great. Still, yeah. I mean, you don't need to be necessarily like muscle-bound. You just need to have a muscle tone and a good body composition.
Yeah. And I got into running as well quite recently. I've always hated running. I always looked at the original marathon race was Hyperlipid, and he dropped dead on the finish line. So that to me summed marathon racing up to me. But I've gotten into Phil Maffetone's aerobic running, heart rate controlled, and it means I run fairly slowly because at 66 your allowed heart rate is quite low. But I get to see the scenery, and I think I've got fairly good aerobic capacity. So I've got aerobic capacity, I've got resistance training, but they're both things that I just do for fun, not that I do for any great protocol.
Well, I love that. I had Phil Maffetone on, and I love that kind of aerobic training, but also I had a great podcast with Cynthia Monteleone, who is a world-class sprinter. So I'd suggest adding a little bit of sprinting, because it is fun. It's not like a job.
Well, Phil Maffetone talks about the Swedish fartlek, where it's interval sprints. So I've been doing aerobic running for 2 years, and now I'm putting sprints in.
I love it.
100 meters maybe, and then let the heart rate back down again. Choose another tree to run to the next tree. That's really good. It's really good. I enjoy that. So I do a little bit of that. But this is random. Phil Maffetone, it was all gain, no pain. That's the sort of thing that I can manage.
Yes, I do like that. That's how I do my workouts too. It's got to be fun and effective. So you brought up John Yudkin, which many people may know from sort of the back in the day with Ansel Keys. They're kind of having competing ideas. Ansel Keys, people probably know. He was the guy. Saturated fat's the enemy. John Yudkin said, it's actually these refined foods like sugar that have come in to the new diet. We'll cover it all in the film, but I guess you could give a little bit of a primer on that, because we're going to jump into saturated fat versus polyunsaturated fat as one of our main topics.
Yeah. Well, if you ever go to PubMed and Google PubMed search Ansel Keys, he was an absolute powerhouse. You look at how many publications there are on the lipid hypothesis and the cholesterol lowering effects of polyunsaturated fatty acids. He moved heaven and earth to get that idea established and well settled. Though interestingly, within probably a couple of years of him launching his campaign, he realized dietary cholesterol was completely irrelevant, and he was probably the first person to backtrack on that. But by the time he'd backtracked on that part of it, it was established political science, and there was no way it was so the Americans are still into their egg white omelets and whatever silly things people might want to do, and they hated each other. It was Yudkin had his idea, Keyes had his idea, and from reading Yudkin, Keyes was something of a bully, and looking even at the technical journal interchanges between them, this was not a discussion of science. This was one person laying down his idea as being right and doing a very successful hatchet job on Yudkin. And Yudkin really, I suppose his problem was he wrote a popular book, the one that I read, and he really was trashed by Keyes, and it was a very one-sided battle from what I can see. Sadly, being correct does not in any way influence your likelihood of being successful. There are many, particularly dietary protocols, which I can't work out the logic of for the life of me, but they can be quite successful without necessarily being effective.
That's an interesting
How
one.
life is.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It's like, yeah, when people say, oh, well, I did a vegan diet or I did a juice fast and it worked. I'm like, well, yeah, it can work short term. But I mean, if you look at the physiology, it's a little more complicated. And there's differences between proper nutrition and short-term fat loss.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Short-term muscle loss as well, for that matter.
Exactly.
But,
well, I just found an article about that was great, talking about you need to look at the muscle composition and that you could be losing muscle, and that you can't just look at the scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I always put weight on when we had lockdown. I lost weight, and when lockdown ended and climbing came back up, I put on 1.5 kilos, and I know it's muscle. Because I'm picking my body weight up and throwing it around again.
Absolutely. Well, okay, so we talked about, Ansel Keys said dietary cholesterol does not affect your body.
Very early on. Yeah, very early on. He initially said it did, but early on he dropped that. But he stuck very hard to the polyunsaturated fatty acid, lowering cholesterol, and lowering cholesterol reduces risk of heart disease. And I have to say that when I first went low carb, and I found that my LDL cholesterol, I think, was about 7.9 millimoles per liter, which and I'm not sure what that is in American terms, 300 something probably.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And at that point, I felt, having just discovered PubMed at that point, I had to go back and see whether I really was killing myself or not by going low carb.
This was about 20 years ago, I believe, 2002, something like that.
Yeah.
2001. Yeah.
Be thereabouts. Yeah. And that brought home very, very strongly how the incredibly rickety base that the cholesterol hypothesis was built on, and how poor the attempts at randomized control trials had done in terms of actually producing any benefit. And at the time, all the trials were very controversial in terms of what was done right and what was done wrong. But the signal really wasn't there that the hypothesis was correct. So it was an education in having been to journal clubs and learning how to take papers apart. You could take the lipid hypothesis papers apart. And for a couple of years, 3 or 4 years probably, I did that quite a lot. Over the decades, I've lost interest, because once you've decided that a hypothesis is garbage, it becomes very difficult to keep going back to it with any level of enthusiasm. So people keep asking me, what do you think about this cholesterol paper or that cholesterol paper? They'll email me, and I have real trouble getting excited about it, because if you haven't measured insulin and you haven't measured postprandial insulin levels and you haven't measured glucose levels, how are you going to say anything about heart disease if all you've measured is low density lipoprotein cholesterol levels? It's almost impossible to fight this sort of level of, people are just measuring the wrong things generally.
Exactly. Well, that's kind of the problem with our system too. It's like you can't even get an insulin test from a doctor. You know,
No,
I've
no.
tried. I've worked with some patients with Dr. Gary, and they were working with their old doctor because of insurance, and the doctor would not give them anything we wanted.
Yeah.
They wouldn't give them the fasting insulin. They wouldn't give. It was crazy. But
Yeah.
so you're saying, okay, for lipid hypothesis is basically what the whole foundation of these bad dietary recommendations are based on, right? They're based on
Yes.
just to catch people up if people don't understand. So this is why we've been pushed from the low fat diet, the PUFAs instead of the natural saturated fats.
Yeah.
This is all because of the lipid hypothesis from 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah, and it was primarily cardiologically driven by the cardiologists who basically went along with it perfectly well, and still do to a very large extent, though there are all sorts of qualifications going in now. Well, it's an inflammatory problem, well, it's this problem, or nowadays, if you've got somebody really up, then oxidized cholesterol, oxidized LDL, there's all sorts of shades to it. But ultimately, from my point of view, I can't convince myself that it's LDL. And even if you find that it is oxidized LDL, then you're going to have to go back and look at why the LDL is oxidized, what you put into the LDL, and what you've generated in terms of free radicals to actually oxidize that lipid in the low density lipoprotein, because or even in fact the protein itself. So from the way I can see it at the moment, if you want to correct the factors that actually damage, if you want to retain the cholesterol hypothesis in some way, shape or form, it's going to be that it's oxidized, which means it's going to have to contain polyunsaturated fatty acids, because you're not going to oxidize by oxidation, you mean oxidative damage, as opposed to oxidized to make energy. So you're not going to get oxidative damage to saturated fats. You get them perfectly well to linoleic acid. And once you've started that process of reactive oxygen species generation, it'll damage the proteins of the lipoprotein as well. So, but you have to go back one step from there. Why did you put the linoleic acid in it, the polyunsaturated fatty acid in it in the first place? Well, you put that in there because your cardiologist told you to. Why did you make lots of reactive oxygen species? Well, you made those because you were hyperglycemic and hyperinsulinemic, and you were trying to put too many calories into a given cell. So if you go back and back and back, then if you hadn't made yourself hypoglycemic and hyperinsulinemic, you may well not have oxidized the low-density lipoprotein cholesterol. So ultimately, managing it should be based on not doing the damage in the first place, not trying to bail out what's happened afterwards. Yeah,
and you've said before that your cardiologist may be the one that have given you this heart disease.
Yeah.
By these recommendations.
It's again one of these things where it's you find is it actually possible that your medical professional could be giving diametrically the absolutely wrong advice, and that is not outside the bounds of possibility. This is a possibility I consider all the time, and it's quite often true.
Well, you just look around and you can see something's going wrong. People blame it on any number of things, but it seems like it's kind of the root cause was once we got the wrong idea about fats, then everything kind of snowballed since then. Like you said, that they kind of made up their mind and it became political, and that this was it. And then that opened the door to the food industry. And then we started replacing, beef tallow in the fryers with like the soybean oil or whatever kind of polyunsaturated fatty acids.
Yeah.
And like you said, we can refer to them as linoleic acid or somewhat interchangeably, but
it is the main one. There are others.
The main one,
Just as an aside, I would just point out that we talk about polyunsaturated fatty acids, and from my point of view, and obviously there are the. You've spoken to Tucker, I assume.
Absolutely.
Tucker Goodrich, yes. And Tucker is very, very focused on the direct damage done by polyunsaturated derivatives. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he's very, very into that, and he's absolutely correct. I've got no arguments with that at all.
Like the breakdown of these and
the breakdown products,
products, yes.
Yeah, because the breakdown products are signaling molecules. Mm-hmm. But people talk about omega-6 fatty acids, and primarily we're talking about linoleic acid. Yeah. When you talk about omega-3 fatty acids, you are primarily talking about DHA and EPA, the 22 and 24 carbon, and they are metabolically completely different from linoleic acid, and their breakdown products are primarily anti-inflammatory. Yeah, they're repair producing, and they're also not metabolized in mitochondria. Linoleic acid is burned, is oxidized in the mitochondria. The very long chain fatty acids, so that's up to 18 carbons. By the time you get to 20 or 22, or longer if you want, then they're targeted to the peroxisomes. They're not burned in the same way. So whenever you see a paper that compares linoleic acid or corn oil, let's say, with fish oil, they're not comparing like with like. They're comparing corn oil is primarily 50% linoleic acid. It's going to go to the mitochondria, and it will have all of the problems that we'll probably mention in passing as we go through. But you give them the patient's fish oil, it's going to be targeted to the peroxisomes. And the peroxisomes, they are signaling things exactly, signaling parts of the cell in exactly the same as mitochondria is, but they're completely separate. Okay, they do talk to each other, so fish oil doesn't behave metabolically in any way the same way as linoleic acid does. If you start with alpha-linolenic acid, which is the other omega-3 fat, that's much more like the corn oil type one. So this is the one in flaxseed. So flaxseed and corn oil are reasonably comparable, but once you start with fish oil, you're in a completely different metabolic circus. They're not metabolized in the same way. So anyway,
it's important. I want to talk about it for a second because they're both PUFAs. So if you just say PUFAs, then you are including fish oil. So that's why I said they're not exactly interchangeable. But sometimes when we refer to PUFAs, we're mainly referring to the bad ones. But the omega-3s, they don't. Some people actually are against them if you are extracting them, like just taking a fish oil pill, they can oxidize. So I want to get your take on this, because I think eating fish in a whole form is fine. And you're saying they're different. They don't do the same things. Yeah. But if you try to extract them out, can they still oxidize, or can they even oxidize in your body 98.6 degrees?
Yeah, this is why people add vitamin E to them to try and stop them. Exactly. All the fish oil supplements have. Exactly. I don't know really is the answer on that one. I'm not that worried about consuming the long chain omega-3 fatty acids, provided the work from rats is quite convincing that if you want to convert ALA, the alpha-linolenic acid, into EPA and DHA, you can do it really well. All you have to do is not have very much linoleic acid around. So if you've got linoleic acid levels very, very low, there's alpha-linolenic acid in beef. And if you're eating beef, not very much linoleic, lots of alpha-linolenic, and your liver should be able to convert the alpha-linolenic acid into EPA and DHA. I haven't checked my levels. I eat fish very, very occasionally, fried in butter, but I don't take a omega-3 fat. I haven't done for the last 15 years. I did at one stage supplement. One does all these very strange things when one is learning, but nowadays I think if you keep your LA levels low, there's every probability that you will manufacture DHA and EPA from the precursor molecule alpha-linolenic acid. So that's the basis I'm working on at the moment, and that way it can still get oxidized, but at least it's being produced in the amount that you need by the system that should normally be producing it. Okay.
And you would have the natural antioxidants in it, like the vitamin E that comes with fish that would supposedly protect you. So basically, if you're not eating, say, the seed oils or the high linoleic acid stuff, you're eating whole foods, you're eating, beef and other stuff and saturated fat, you're fine. You can eat whole food. It's just interesting that some people are even trying to go against the omega-3s, but I guess maybe they're mainly against it in the isolated, extracted form.
There back in the very, very early, I think I've seen a rumor that somebody is going to podcast Ray Peat. Have you come across Ray Peat at all?
I have, absolutely. Okay. I want to talk about that. Maybe we could save more to the end, but yes.
But he back in the early days of my nutrition, I had disciples of his coming on my blog and saying this and this and this and this, and I wasn't educated enough to appreciate quite how interesting Peat's ideas might be. So I'll be very interested to hear what he's got to say. But they pointed to a certain number of things out that fish oil can be actually quite bad news for your liver. And there were the fact that fish oils lower your triglycerides in your plasma does not necessarily mean they lower your triglycerides in your liver. And if they're not in your plasma and you're still producing them in the first place, they're going to be sitting there in your liver. And there were some markers from some papers that Peat followers sent to me, and I thought, well, you might have something. And of course, the alcohol studies with fish oil, I mean, alcohol and fish oil just do not mix at all. So if you feed rodents high fish oil diet with alcohol, it's even worse than feeding it with corn oil. They get cirrhosis very, very rapidly if you do that.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
We'll bring up Ray Peat. I think he's super interesting. I love learning about the different kind of dietary camps, and I'm really getting more interested in his stuff. But yeah, I just don't like getting super dogmatic of one way of thinking, and
he's very extreme. Well, so am I. But he's even more extreme than myself, or I think even Tucker. But even worse, people who follow him, who try and spread the word to nutrition blogs like mine was 15, 20 years ago, are even more dogmatic. So they were quite difficult to follow. But the more I've thought about it and the more I've learned, I think he's a potentially very interesting chap, actually.
Yes.
So we'll see what...
Someone called them pedophiles. The pedophiles.
I missed that one. I wish I'd thought of that one.
Yeah, it's hilarious. Someone commented on that, and they were kind of making fun of them. And it is fun.
As commenters, they are complete pain. On
they are.
They were a complete pain.
I like to be open. Well, I still think the vegan commenters are worse. I deal with them a lot, but I like to try to learn from them, and we will get into this. He does have a lot of great stuff on why linoleic acid is bad and why he's into eating nose to tail animal foods. Saturated fat is great. He's talking more about fruit is okay, and so which is fine. This is what you believe in. That if we jump to it, that saturated fat is not the problem, and that the polyunsaturated, mainly the linoleic acid, is a problem, especially when we're talking about type 2 diabetes, for example. That starch, or that's not the actual problem. I mean, it gets in the way. People overeat a lot of these refined foods, and it's a long story of how they're connected. But when you really get down to it, I think your idea as well is that it is the linoleic acid, and these.
Well, I entered nutrition directly via low carb, via Atkins. And it became pretty obvious, that it worked. It was fantastic. I was never overweight. I was very active, but I had a little tummy that maybe 2 kilos of fat, something like that. And I always thought, well, if I just skip one meal, maybe if I skipped 2 meals, that would all go away, and then it just would be fine. And I could never do it. You were always hungry. You couldn't. I couldn't skip a meal. I was very insulin sensitive, and I would be clinically hypoglycemic. Though actually, if you measure glucose when you're clinically hypoglycemic, it's quite often normal. Mine always was whenever I measured it. And I could never. And I did Atkins induction, and my appetite just disappeared, and the little bit of fat that I did carry that I wanted rid of just disappeared. And I was utterly fascinated by this. I felt that this is absolutely correct. And then people throw at you all sorts of other other diets that can work perfectly well, high in starch, high in insulin secretion ability, and I kind of had them at the back of my mind, but there were an awful lot of studies which are very supportive of the simple low carb carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, but it clearly had problems, and I realized from fairly early on, A, that it worked amazingly well, and B, that there were problems fitting all the little snippets of information into it that you really had to fit into it. And I think it took me probably nearly 10 years to start to think about this whole business of linoleic acid and how you stored fat and how you released fat and what factors were involved with it. And it turned out to be a lot more than low carbing. And that, again, with hindsight, a lot of Ray Peat's followers were not particularly enamored with low carbing. And as the years have gone by, though I have absolutely no problem with saying that if you're in metabolic syndrome, you've got metabolic problems, just low carb. That's your starting point. It doesn't cure the problem. It sidesteps the problem, and it sidesteps it within a week, maybe a month. If you're a seriously type 2 diabetic, you'll get marked improvement. But the fact that withdrawing the carbohydrate, to me, has never really meant that the carbohydrate was the cause. And I'm quite convinced that it's not. So you could almost say that makes me an anti-low carber, despite the fact that I'm completely convinced that low carbing works extremely well.
It's funny. No, it's so complicated. You're right. Just those two things it's not a zero-sum game, I guess you could say. They can exist simultaneously. Something can be effective, but removing the carbs is effective, but doesn't mean it's necessarily the problem.
No, and the whole fructose thing is interesting because and again, I don't want to keep coming back to Ray Peat, but he's very keen on fruit, and he's actually, I think, pretty keen on fructose generally, and that to me is, again, there are studies that will back that up extremely well, but anything epidemiological, fructose is just a complete disaster area. But you have to wonder what else is going on over and above the fructose. So to me, fructose in terms of toxicity and fructose and insulin resistance and fructose and obesity is very, very complicated. And I do not have a mental framework that I have in the way that I have with saturated fats versus linoleic acid, omega-6 polyunsaturated fats. I've got a lot more thinking to do about fructose, and I think the simple message that fructose is bad might actually be context related. I don't think it would be quite that simple.
It's all the confounding factors. And I haven't gone down the fructose rabbit hole other than what you're talking about at the surface level. It seems bad in high amounts and causing problems with fatty liver, and it's just better to when people cut it out. But that's, again, that's not the end all be all. Just because people can cut out fruit and sugar and lose weight.
Because when you low carb, you change many things at the same time.
Exactly. But I still think, I'm on your page too. Go low carb. You have type 2 diabetes. Let's go low carb. Let's do it. But I really want to get to the bottom of this stuff because so many things have been demonized incorrectly, and I just want to know, like, what is the real story? Because yes, maybe people can eat fruit, and I think they absolutely can in the context of a different diet. If you're not you're not eating all the linoleic acid, you're eating meat and fruit. This is what we did in Africa. This is when you study hunter-gatherer tribes. This is what they ate. This is what we ate. What we had available was goat meat and fruit, and I lost weight in Africa. I didn't even think I had weight to lose.
Honey as well.
Honey, absolutely. We went and got some fresh honey out of the tree with the hadza. And so there's so much context, but most people, they're eating it in a completely wrong context. If you're just eating a standard American diet and then they're like, oh, well, honey and fruit are fine, I'm going to eat the standard American diet plus more honey and fruit, you're just going to gain more weight.
Yes. The question really is, does eating fructose give you fatty liver in the absence of linoleic acid? That's an interesting question to answer. And I think the rodent studies, there are lots of rodent studies out there that suggest that fructose in the absence of linoleic acid doesn't give fatty liver. You can push the studies whichever way you like, because they're rodent studies. You can push them, and having them in the drink, putting the fructose in the drinking water seems to be something that's not at all well tolerated. That appears to be one of the most reliable ways of showing fructose is bad, is you put it in the drinking water rather than in the food. But I have a friend who sent me a paper a month or so ago where I hadn't really started going through fructose metabolism properly, but I always thought that the liver was the target organ that dealt with fructose, and spillover got to adipocytes into the systemic circulation. Well, that's not right. That's fairly incorrect, because fructose normally is converted to palmitic acid by the enterocytes in the gut. The liver deals with what the gut can't convert to palmitic acid, and the adipocytes only ever see fructose when there's been a massive overload of both gut processing ability, gut lining processing ability, and liver processing ability. Then the adipocytes will start taking fructose up and converting, and everything converts into palmitic acid, which is fine by me because I quite like palmitic acid. So if you didn't have the fattening effects of linoleic acid, would you get the fattening effects on adipocytes from fructose, and would you get the fattening effects on liver from fructose if there was nothing there to amplify the storage ability, which what linoleic acid does? So it's a really, really interesting subject, and it's I didn't start with fructose. I started with fats because the arithmetic at the cellular level is relatively straightforward with the different fatty acids that we can or can't consume. But with fructose, the metabolism is so different in such different places that it's not intuitive exactly what's happening. There's a lot of stuff to check up on it. Well, I haven't gone there yet.
Yeah, well, there's even more context there. You're even bringing up like the status of the person's gut health.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And it's, so again, just most people probably have damaged guts, and they're metabolically damaged and all these things. So maybe you should avoid honey. Just because, we have a friend, Paul Saladino, that you did a podcast with him, went way deeper into all this stuff that we're about to get into. So yeah, I wanted to throw that out there. At some point, you can go back and listen to 2-part, you and Paul deep dive into electron transport chain, all that type of stuff, proton theory. We're not going to do all that. We're going to stay higher level in this podcast, but he's fit, good health, good gut lining. He's adding honey. I'm, adding honey, trying out these new things, doing great. I just see so many people I talk to, work with, whatever, and they don't have the same experience. And I think it's because they're not healthy. They're not ready for this.
Well, classically, fructose will trigger IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, in a very large proportion of people nowadays, because it's not absorbed properly, it's fermented by the gut bacteria, and you get gas, bloating, and stomach pain. But I can't imagine that Hasda would be going out and eating kilos of honey if they could find it, if it gave them gut rot all the time.
No.
So as you say, context, I think, is going to be everything on that basis.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump into kind of your ideas here. I mentioned some of your stuff. You have a great blog that I have not attempted to read, sadly. I don't think I have the time or the mental capacity to jump in there.
Sadly, it's not terribly ordered either. And again, the basic core ideas, I think the basic core ideas that I work by dropped into about 55 blog posts. So even if you just go to the core ideas, it's huge, and I ought to make it simpler somewhere along the line. But the core idea that was easy to get hold of is that gaining weight and losing weight is about storing calories, and you normally limit your weight. A normal human being limits their weight to a, inverted commas, reasonable fat mass, which is adequate to keep you going for a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, maybe, if the hunting's been bad. So there's a fat mass you should have. Humans seem to like having a decent fat mass. But there is a whole signaling process that controls that. And insulin pushes fat into fat cells, but something has to stop it pushing an infinite supply of fat into fat cells when you've eaten. And the whole concept that dawned on me about 10 years ago was that linoleic acid stopped that stop signal being produced. So if you ate French fried potatoes, we call them chips, fried in beef tallow, then you'd eat a certain amount of them, you'd go, oh my God, I can't eat anymore, and you'd stop. And your fat cells would have taken up as much fat from the frying and any carbohydrate that they picked up and converted that to palmitic acid as well. But they would stay stopped. Your fat cells would have had enough fat, and by various different mechanisms, they would talk to your brain, and your brain would say, stop eating. Okay. That signal doesn't come if you replace the saturated fats with corn oil or sunflower oil or whatever the polyunsaturated fat you fancy, canola oil. And if that signal doesn't come, you keep eating, but you keep eating because your fat cells are still accepting calories in. So as soon as you eat anything, you lose those calories into your fat cells, and that's where it stays. And it's insulin that puts the fat in there, but insulin should, once they're full, stop signaling. There should be okay, we've got enough fat on board now. Let's just stop eating, stop accepting calories. And the signaling system in the fat cell is hugely influenced, in my opinion, by linoleic acid. The stop signal fails under linoleic acid, and the stop signal comes with palmitic acid, the saturated fats. And again, it's hard to pin the fine detailed data, but there is fairly good evidence that there's a similar system built into the brainstem, where the brainstem monitors what calories are available, and when the brainstem is seeing enough calories available, it signals to the cortex to say, okay, don't bother eating anymore. How much of that you can override is again you can then get into neurophysiology and neuropharmacology, and which neurons do which and which do that and which do the other, but they're all controlled by reactive oxygen species, which is where I've basically come from with the whole of what makes you get fat is that you can't stop losing fat into your fat cells. And whenever you're losing fat into your fat cells, your brain isn't going to pick up that you've eaten enough.
This is super interesting. We've got to get into so that hopefully that made sense to people. So people know your fat cells. Well, there's always a flux in and out from your fat cells.
Yes.
But yeah, just and you don't people know this by now if they've listened to my show. If not, you should go back and start at the beginning. Ted Naiman is episode 1, and he talks about this in episode 1 years and years ago. But you get the problems, you become obese, you become insulin resistant, diabetic, all that when your fat cells are overstuffed, right?
Yes.
They get too full, and you're talking about the actual mechanism of the signaling of why they get too full, and it matters what types of fat they're getting.
I had no idea I was going to end up there. No idea at all. I didn't have that as an end target, and I was going to work out what fats did to make that happen. I just was curious. I started off, what's the difference between oxidizing glucose and oxidizing fats? And that was the original, and I had to go back and relearn all my biochemistry and the Krebs cycle, and I'd forgotten about the electron transport chain and what it did and how it did it. I had to go and relearn it all. I hadn't used it for 25 years since I'd passed my kicking out exams. So I had to learn all of that. And then it dawned on me that actually the difference between sugar and fat was a big leap in terms of how they're processed, but the different fats were different. And then it dawned on me that the saturated fats and the polyunsaturated fats, omega-6s, were fundamentally different in terms of how they were, what signals they gave. And that's where I ended up with that. And it was basically, if you wanted to summarize it, it would be a failure of the omega-6 fatty acids to signal satiety at the cellular level.
The cellular level. Okay, this is huge because I wanted to get into satiety, and I'm always into the highest level and making it
that's
easy.
a big break. But that's
What
and that
amplifies
it.
Okay, so omega. So on the cellular level, you're going to get into that, but I want to jump out for a second with the satiety part, because I think you're talking about over time, or we're talking about over time gaining weight. And I think you said you can't just be hungry forever, or this is one of my biggest things. You can lose weight on any type of diet temporarily, but you cannot just be hungry forever. So if you have the wrong satiety foods, each food, I pitched this to Ted Naiman years ago, that each food has a satiety to calorie kind of ratio.
Yeah.
Right. If you are eating foods with the correct satiety to calories, then you will be okay. Well, really, you're going to tell us how it comes down to the fats. So which foods have the right fats. But if you have foods that have the appropriate satiety, over time, you will be fine. If you eat foods that don't have the right satiety, and it could get down to being orange juice or being the wrong kinds of fats, you probably will not be able to maintain weight, because you cannot just starve yourself forever.
Nobody can do that forever. That's it. People, I mean, you go online and people do it. But
I know girls in LA
like that.
Girls in LA will do it for years. Their whole 20s and early 30s, they'll just are hungry. Like their entire plan is to be hungry for every day and work out a lot.
And this is not human physiology. This is we're not supposed to do that. It's not survivable.
Some people force it, but then you could say, well, how do people on some of these vegans or more plant-based diets do it? Well, if you're eating a whole bunch of whole foods and you're getting enough sort of saturated fats, you can do okay, because
if you're low enough fat, you're not taking any linoleic acid in, and a starch-based diet has its own method of saying to the fat cells that they're full. It's completely different to the system that the fats use. I won't go into it because we didn't want to go into molecular lumps and bumps and electrons here and there. But there is a satiety signal generated by a combination of insulin and glucose, which does very, very similar things to the signal which is generated by fatty acids if they're saturated compared to non-saturated. And because of energy production is not from one source or another, it's a completely integrated system. And if you mess up the fatty acid component of it, it will have a knock-on effect on the carbohydrate bit. So if you're on a very, very low fat vegan diet, you won't be healthy for a moment you would, but you won't be fat either, because you've got the carbohydrate and insulin, and those two in combination, there are biochemical quirks that they give a stop signal to the filling up of fat cells by a related method to the way that fats do. But when you have fats and carbohydrates, it's like an integrated circuit chip or a computer chip. It takes this input and that input, and the mitochondria, the energy producing cells, integrate what energy status the cell is at. And if you drop linoleic acid into the fatty part of it, it will also mess up the glucose part of it. At that point, then carbohydrates become intensely fattening. Because the carbohydrates pump up insulin, and your fatty acid composition has stopped the satiety signal for the cell. Then the carbohydrate will just make loads of insulin. And if you're amplifying the insulin signal or failing to limit the insulin signal, and the insulin signal is very low, you ain't going to notice that. But if the insulin signal's through the roof and you make it work better and better and better, then you're going to put a ton of fat on. But I think the vegans and the very low fat people get away with it because they're so low in absolute fat that the polyunsaturates are low as well. And that means that the integrated circuit that controls satiety still works as it should do. It'll be deficient in everything, but
there's two different. I love that there's two different mechanisms. I was always trying to figure that out in my early days when I was very into low carb, and I was like, how does this work? How does the potato diet work? But there's different things going on, and now everything makes sense, and there's different systems. And then there's this idea that you don't want to mix these systems. It's not impossible to have a mixed carb and fat diet. I think those people, especially if you're not eating the linoleic acid, but people can do it and not overeat. But I think generally people who do try to do the mixed diets are the calorie counting people. So their idea to limit is portion control, calorie counting. And the people who go high fat or low fat, they don't need to do that because it's naturally regulated.
But the opposite ends of a spectrum. Yeah, the regulation of a high-fat diet where really insulin doesn't come into there's almost no insulin signaling if you're getting, let's say, 85% of your calories from fat. Insulin will barely budge, so it doesn't matter if there's an overzealous insulin signal, because there isn't an insulin signal. You can't make it overzealous. But I think if you're on a mixed diet and you're having a lot of carbohydrate, a lot of fat, then that limitation, the failure to limit the satiety, or the failure to generate satiety when you should do, that's going to be the worst case scenario, because there's going to be a lot of insulin around, and the linoleic acid will sensitize the fat cells to get fatter with the insulin, and that's when things take off. Opposite extreme, you're on the absolute diametric opposite. Loads of insulin around, but not very much fat around, so not very much linoleic acid. So the normal insulin control system works perfectly well to limit insulin signaling when the fat cells has had enough.
And and there's not even much fat to store. If you're on a very, very low fat diet, it's just, there's not much fat to even store. So I understood that a while back. That's why those people don't get fat. I mean, even if there is high insulin, there's just not. Okay. So,
and the other thing that came to mind was that you don't need a very big disturbance. People talk about, well, how much linoleic acid is bad. Well, again, your point earlier on was that there's a large flux. When you eat a high-fat meal, an awful lot of it is going to end up in your fat cells, and it's just going to come out again. Because if you're on a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, insulin levels are low, there's not that much insulin signaling, it will come back out again. You only need 3 grams per day, half a teaspoonful of excess fat storage to gain 1 kilo in a year. Okay, and in 20 years, that's 20 kilos. In 40 years, that's 40 kilos. This does not have to be a big effect. The fact that if you either wipe out carbohydrate from the diet or wipe out linoleic acid from the diet and you get weight loss in a matter of weeks, to me is absolutely amazing. That you can do it so quickly. But weight gain is not a rapid thing. It's a long-term, low-grade thing, and you're only talking about 3 grams per day for 1 kilo, just over 1 kilo per year, and that's the standard middle-age weight gain rate that people go at, unless they're completely
the Western world is fat and sick by the time they're middle-aged, and because of that. So then what do you count for? So we're talking about just 3 grams per day. So you're saying that these satiety signaling at the cellular level, and with the linoleic acid, that's enough to screw your body's regulation methods.
It only needs to screw it by 3 grams a day. That's all. I mean, obviously, and how much linoleic acid you have to do that is negotiable, but probably somewhere between 4% and whatever you care to mention. I think up to about 20%, it just gets worse and worse and worse. There are very strong.
Many people are doing.
Well, there are quite strong signals that if actually you just drink linoleic acid up to 60-70% of your calories, you will actually stay slim. There is another mechanism kicks in at the very, very top end, but that's not really a recognizable human diet. But you can do it with rodents, and I have this love of rodent studies. I'm very, very pro rodent studies. I think that provided you accept that black 6 mice have got broken mitochondria, the mitochondria don't work properly. So that's a big confounder for many, many, many studies. And it's a genetic thing. It's only black 6 mice, and they're the ones that are used for everything. So the black 6 mice have got broken mitochondria, but all of the other ones, the rat studies, and they're all, to me, there's almost no difference between a rat mitochondrion energy producing system and a human energy producing system. These are intensely conserved on an evolutionary basis. It's really, I have a lot of time for rodent studies, and if the rodent study doesn't fit in with what happens in people, that to me is a big flag that you should be questioning exactly what's gone on in the rodent study and what's going on in the human study, and they should be reconcilable. And these are things that over the years I've not been able to leave alone, that you go back and you'll have a study that you can't understand, and I stick it in the back of my head, and I kind of just, it turns over, and occasionally then you'll pick up another piece of information from another non-related search and go, right, now we can sort that out. And you go back and sort that out. And then another protons post comes out that is
So that's really
explains some of the
interesting.
things you got wrong to begin with.
Well, no, tell me more about these studies, because there's so many conflicting rodent studies. But are you saying that you can explain them away with your knowledge that why this happened
Mostly, yes.
in this study? Like, yeah.
I've got a handful of them that I really can't, and they're going to bug me for a long time. Sorry, my daughter is just. Do you need me, Hazel?
Can I go to the park? Jessica's here.
Jessica's here. You can go for an hour. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Most of the rodent studies are explicable, but you have to go down to the level either of the electron transport chain, which is the very, very most basic, which we weren't going to go, but you can, most of them will explain at that level, or they explain at the level of uncoupling proteins, which are the ones that convert fat you've eaten into heat. And occasionally you have to go to peroxisomes, which is another organelle within the cell, a bit like a mitochondrion, but doesn't generate energy, generates mostly heat as well, actually. But our knowledge of what happens in peroxisomes is rudimentary in the absolute extreme. People are just starting to develop models, usually in rodents, where you can turn on and turn off peroxisome generation or peroxisomal enzymes, and they're just this last couple of years people are starting to look at this. But if you as you accumulate information, most of the rodent studies are completely explicable. And I'm a lover of rodent studies. I always take them with a very slight pinch of salt. And I've had ones that I've found utterly inexplicable until you find this piece of information that says, okay, that's what's going on. But you're down at electron transport chain level to get a lot of the explanations.
Is there a way to talk about that without diving into all the details, just to give people some idea?
Well, again, you go back to Tucker again, if you eat enough linoleic acid, and you get it really, I think it starts to kick in. Well, it probably kicks in right from the beginning at very low dose rates, but at the obesogenic levels of linoleic acid, it just makes you fat. Yep. If you can get the percentage of your calories up to 40% as linoleic acid or 45% as linoleic acid, so this is where you're more or less drinking pure corn oil. Please don't do this. It's not good. But if you do that, the linoleic acid oxidizes, and it will get, if there's enough of it around, which there will be, it will get damaged, and you'll get 4-HNE, hydroxynonenal, I think is the 4-HNE. It's a toxic breakdown product of linoleic acid. But small amounts of 4-HNE signal to the cell that there's way too much energy available in this cell. There's so much energy that that electrons are damaging the cellular machinery, and the 4-HNE will trigger uncoupling. And uncoupling is basically a system where the body wastes the ability to generate ATP. Instead of generating ATP, it generates heat. You sweat the heat off. It's fair enough. You can do that perfectly well. But if you convert energy into heat, then that system will stop you getting fat. It's not as simple as calories out. You get, again, it goes into, there are effects of uncoupling, not only that generate heat, but they also suppress insulin signaling as well. But again, we're getting beyond where we decided we were going to talk about today. So, but ultimately, if you eat enough polyunsaturated fatty acids, particularly omega-6s, omega-3s do it as well. The alpha-linolenic acid will do it even better. But you will generate uncoupling, and the uncoupling takes cellular energy and converts it into heat, which is wasted, and it's done as a defense mechanism. It's the cell will not tolerate being told to generate way more energy than it requires. It's just not something that the cell should ever do. And if it gets put into a situation where it's got to do that, then it will uncouple, and the mitochondria will stop generating ATP, and they'll start generating heat instead. And that's triggered by omega-6 fatty acids.
And that's at the super high level.
Yeah. That's way beyond anything that you would remotely consider as a nutritional supplement or anything like that. But with rodent studies, you can do this. And I like to understand rodent studies, and I could never work out how you could give these rodents massive levels of omega-6s, and they stayed slim, and their insulin stayed low, and they stayed insulin sensitive, and they look pretty healthy, actually, metabolically. But there's a sweet spot for getting really ill really quick, which is really between 4% and 24%. And above 24%, the uncoupling starts to become more and more obvious, until by 45%, it's the predominant metabolic fate of the linoleic acid breakdown.
So I just want to throw out, I think most people, I'll just say, use America as an example. 88% are metabolically unwell. We can look around, we see we're not well. It seems like most of those people are in that 4% to 24% window. No one's, like you said.
Yeah. I think nobody's in the
no one's chugging the corn oil, and then no one, except for our crowd, is down in the 1 to 2% range, which was what you should be. And I've had many podcasts, looking at Chris Kenobi, Tucker Goodrich, Dr. Kate Shanahan, Paul Saladino, all these people talking about this is our ancestrally appropriate, where we should be. This is the foods we had access to, and this is where we were at. Yeah.
I would go along with that completely. Yes.
Okay.
But we got onto this subject because rodent studies, and this is why I like rodent studies, not because they tell you about human diet, but they tell you about the core basic physiology of how cells protect themselves so they don't break. Okay. And that then does weird things when you get to extremes. Okay, so but I would go back from my own point of view. Beef fat is perfect. I love beef fat.
I love that. We simplified it all down to just eat beef fat. And it's a great message. No, it's super great. We'll go into a little bit more detail on just what happens at a cellular level with the different type of fats it'll get. And it's a little bit counterintuitive, but you can explain it. Brad Marshall was on the show, kind of explained some of this, and we brought you up. So another reason why I had to have you on is we've been referencing you. But
Brad has been looking up the ideas that I started. He's taken them off in his own directions, and he's doing a really good job.
Yeah, he credits you for getting him on the track. But what goes on? It's almost counterintuitive, where you want your cells to be insulin resistant at certain times and insulin sensitive. So please tell us more.
Well, if you want the ultimate extreme, I think Tucker gave me the ultimate extreme, was where they were basically taking a polyunsaturated fat and boiling it for 3 days in contact with room air. So it was all full of 9-hydroxy, 4-hydroxy, non-enol, 4-HNE, and they fed it to rats. And the rats were really ill. they did really badly. Didn't get any weight. Well, you could just argue that they were so ill from the toxicity of the oxidized oil that they didn't gain weight because they felt so crap. But you could say that 4-HNE generates insulin resistance. And if you generate insulin resistance, how are you going to put fat into fat cells? You can't. If you look at people with leprechauns, I forget what the politically correct term is now for leprechaunism. It's somebody other syndrome, but they've got no insulin receptors on their adipocyte, on anything basically, or they have poorly functional insulin receptors, and they're very ill. They're very dwarfed because there's no insulin acting on ILGF-1 receptors. I won't go on to growth hormone. But these people, or people with congenital lipodystrophy, they can't put fat into fat cells, either because the fat cells aren't there, or if you've fed an insulin resistance generator, they can't put fat into the fat cells because your 4-HNE is blocking the action of insulin. And these animals in the models, because you can't do 4-HNE in people, but these animals don't get fat because they are made insulin resistant. And if you're insulin resistant, how is insulin going to put fat into fat cells? So the counter to that argument is that if they're insulin resistant, how can you keep fat in fat cells? So they should also, not only can you not put it in, but they should also be losing fat at the same time as well. And ultimately, these rodents that were fed 4-HNE diets stayed slim. They're very ill. If you did a glucose tolerance test on them, it was off the top of the scale. I can't remember whether they were hyperinsulinemic or not, but I expect they probably would have been. But ultimately, they weren't fat. Okay. And there are loads of studies from humans. I started off with, there was a Danish study. I can't remember the professor's name now, but basically he took morbidly obese ladies, slimmed them down to normal body weight, and looked at their blood insulin levels. And I came up through the carbohydrate insulin model of hypothesis of obesity, and I expected that insulin resistance came first. That caused reactive hyperinsulinemia. That caused fat gain because insulin inhibits fat loss quicker than it lowers blood glucose levels. And that was Atkins's idea, and I came up through that one. So when I looked at the Danish paper, they slimmed these ladies down, and their insulin levels were way below those of normal weight volunteers who'd never been overweight at all. And you could make all arguments about shrunken fat cells not producing leptin the way they should do and all this sort of thing. But ultimately, these people who had been obese or had become obese and then had it forcibly reversed, and this was not low carbing, but they'd simply been starved down to normal body weight, were more insulin sensitive by quite a lot. I think there was half the level of fasting insulin. And as you and I know full well, if you allow a post-obese person to eat ad lib, they will immediately, within months, regain all the weight they've lost. But these people were very, very insulin sensitive when you looked at fasting glucose, fasting insulin. And that stood to me, the counterintuitive thing was that insulin sensitivity makes you fat. Whereas every study you see where you slim people down, it improves their insulin sensitivity. So the kind of logical assumption is that losing weight makes you insulin sensitive. It must have been the insulin resistance that made you fat in the first place. But it's not, doesn't work that way around. The Danish study was my first marker that I might be barking up the wrong tree completely. And then I think there was Mexico study where they looked at the children of obese parents, and they looked who were still normal weight in their teens, but both parents were obese, and they looked at children matched for the other group whose parents were not overweight. So you'd have two groups of people all weighing X kilos. The sad news is if your parents are overweight, the chance of you not becoming overweight as well are pretty small. So you can describe these people who've got overweight parents, both parents overweight, as being pre-obese. Yeah, that's obesity is probably going to come and get them because they learned their food habits at their mother's knee. And the insulin levels and the glucose levels in the people who were destined to become fat were lower than those of the people who were not destined to become fat. So these people who were going to become fat were more insulin sensitive. And to me, that makes complete sense because if insulin drives fat storage, then being insulin sensitive should also drive fat storage. And the difference between becoming overweight or not becoming overweight is at what level of calorie intake does that fat storage get told to stop? Yeah, that's why this again goes back to the polyunsaturated versus saturated. But people who are destined to become obese, if you get them before they've become obese, then they're more insulin sensitive than the people who are going to. So it's a U-shaped curve. Being insulin resistant is just bad and you're fat. But having a normal insulin sensitivity is ideal. Being too insulin sensitive, which is what polyunsaturated fatty acids do to you, means you're going to become fat. Okay, and you don't. My presumption with those particular studies was that it was diet related, but you can do it in different ways. You can take a needle electrode onto a mouse or a rat and burn a bit of its ventromedial hypothalamus out, and the rat or the mouse will then eat until it's spherical. Yep, that's. And if you measure its insulin sensitivity, by the time it's got 3 times the body weight it should have, it will be insulin resistant. No arguing with that at all. But if you measure the insulin sensitivity after you've damaged its brain but before it's managed to gain weight, it will be more insulin sensitive than the control group. You can do the same with MSG injury. There's a standard rat model of obesity where you treat young rats, baby rats, with monosodium glutamate. It damages a bit of their brain. But before they become obese, they are more insulin sensitive than the control group. Once they become obese, they're insulin resistant. And you can do the same with gold-thigh glucose as well. It's another neurotoxin in the brainstem. So this to me says that insulin sensitivity that is you're too insulin sensitive is where you get fat. That's what drives you to store excess fat. Once you've stored enough excess fat, then you become insulin resistant. Well, A, to stop you getting any fatter, and B, to stop you being hungry, and C, there's a change goes on the adipocytes when they get above a certain size. So when you get above a certain body weight, it gets harder to become fat, to get any fatter. There's a natural plateauing. And again, people looked at the Pima Indians. If you're already partially insulin resistant at the start of a study, 5 years later, you're much less likely to be any fatter. Whereas if you're still fairly insulin sensitive, your chances of being fatter are way, 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 way higher by the 5 years down the road of the study. So insulin sensitive people put the most weight on. Insulin resistant people put the least weight on. That's not saying that one's healthier than the other, because the ones who are insulin resistant will have gotten into trouble sooner because of the metabolic problems. But in terms of actual body weight, insulin sensitivity is what makes you fat, not resistance. Okay.
That's super awesome. We got to go further so we can completely cement this in people's heads. And also, becoming insulin resistant is kind of your body protecting you.
Yes. Yeah. If you if you get fat enough, you start to leak fatty acids from your fat cells. And there's nothing accidental about it. Nothing in metabolism is ever accidental. But there's, as the fat droplet within the fat cell gets bigger and bigger and bigger, there's a protein on the surface of the fat droplet that starts to send a signal. And that signal says, this fat droplet is way too big. I don't care what insulin's saying at the moment. Let's just offload some fat. Yeah. So there are actually many, but there are two commonly discussed ways of breaking down fat. One is by hormone-sensitive lipase. And if you're, for whatever reason, you're chronically hyperinsulinemic, if your insulin levels are through the roof all the time, you can just kiss hormone-sensitive lipase goodbye. If insulin's high, hormone-sensitive lipase is not going to work. So if your insulin levels are high, it's very hard to lose fat. Mm-hmm. But the other fatty acid breakdown system is adipose tissue triglyceride lipase, ATGL. That is not controlled by insulin. That's controlled by the size of the fat cell. And as the fat cell gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it starts, through in a very controlled manner, to release free fatty acids to offload from the size of the adipocyte. So irrespective of what your insulin level is, adipose triglyceride lipase will offload free fatty acids. And you then have a situation where, irrespective of insulin, irrespective of carbohydrate intake, you've got free fatty acids released from your adipocytes circulating in your bloodstream. And if you take somebody with type 2 diabetes, their free fatty acid levels can be over 1,000 micromoles per liter. Mm-hmm. They can be right up at, even if you've eaten recently, they can be as high as a young, fit, healthy person is if they've been fasting for 60 hours. Yeah, so you're up over the 1,000 micromoles per liter. So adipose triglyceride lipase keeps releasing fatty acids without any concern about insulin. And it's not going to listen to insulin. So you end up in a situation where your cells are being supplied with a ton of fat. You haven't eaten it. It's come from your fat cells. It's being released in an uncontrolled or not insulin-controlled manner. And you've also just eaten a donut. So blood sugar levels and blood insulin levels are through the roof. So you've got a lot of calories being supplied. What should have happened was, if you ate a donut, is that glucose level goes up, insulin level goes up, and you normalize blood glucose. But at that point, free fatty acids, if hormone-sensitive lipase is working, free fatty acids aren't released. But adipose triglyceride lipase will still release them. So you've then got your donut with elevated fatty acids. That's way more calories than the cell knows what to do with. And the only way that the rest of the cells in the body can deal with that is to say, look, there's too many calories coming in. We can't do anything about the fats because they'll come in through CD36 receptors. There are ways for fats to get into cells without needing insulin. The only way we can sort this energy overload problem out is to say no more glucose. We'll just shut down the insulin receptors. We'll get the GLUT4 transporters off of the cell surface membrane, and we'll shut down insulin signaling. And you then run on the fat plus just enough carbohydrate to meet the fat required. So you then become insulin resistant, but you've become insulin resistant because your fat cells are supplying calories that you shouldn't really have had. Yeah, that should have been shut down by the insulin produced when you ate the donut. What's going on up in the brain? That's a different matter. That gets even more complicated. But this is where physiologically adaptive insulin resistance comes from. Most people with type 2 diabetes are hyperglycemic, hyperinsulinemic, and hyperlipidemic all at the same time, and that should never happen. If you hadn't stretched the fat cells to the point where they were using adipose triglyceride lipase, if they were still running with hormone-sensitive lipase flicking on and off as insulin went up and down, then the problem never occurred. And if you give a drug which shuts all fatty acid release down, so there's a Sipamox is the standard drug for shutting fat release down, and it doesn't care why the fat's being released, it just shuts all fat release down. You can 90% reverse type 2 diabetes overnight. You just shut down the free fatty acid release, all the signaling goes back to normal. You can't keep doing it, because if you do it for a day, for 2 days, for 3 days, the adipocytes will just get bigger. And every time the Sipamox wears off, then the cell realizes that it's got a ton of fat on board, and adipose triglyceride lipase kicks into massive overdrive, and there's extra lipid released before the next dose of Sipamox comes in. So it doesn't work long term for it. But the studies done in humans for a couple of days, or even if you really push it for a couple of weeks, you can almost reverse metabolic syndrome completely just by stopping the adipocytes releasing their fat accidentally.
Well, can people use it in conjunction with changing their diet?
I wouldn't, basically. I've no idea whether it could be done or not.
Well, I'm just wondering if that's like effective at all, or it's just one more of these drugs that just.
There is such a compensation to it when you use it for any period of time that I think it works for a week or two, and there'll be when it works for the week or two, the adipocytes will get a bit bigger. But as they get that bit bigger, they get better and better and better at releasing free fatty acids as soon as the drug wears off. And so instead of oscillating around a small or a big size, they'll oscillate around an even bigger size, but they'll still oscillate around it. And you can't fix the problem on a long-term basis by doing that. It's a fascinating insight in terms of why insulin resistance can still be protective, and why it's essential. You really want it there. And you have to ask questions of what happens if you don't limit calorie intake into cells. And that's a complete other can of worms.
Yeah. So, okay, there's so many things we can get into, but one, you mentioned the brain part. I wanted to throw this in. You talked about the brainstem too, and satiety. I think there's two things going on there. There actually is, like your body actually needs nutrients and you're hungry. And then there's people who just override that anyway, or they eat when they're not hungry, which is a completely different thing. Is people have all kinds of different trauma or habits or whatever, right? And they can just keep eating when they're not even hungry. And I've done it before. I've eaten when I'm not hungry. I get it.
Yeah, my wife finds me infuriating because I don't do that. She says, you just don't understand.
Yeah, well,
this is a big blind hole in my thinking. I've come at this from the most basic biochemical background. And
this is like a whole new ball game, though. Yeah, it's like you can have all the biochemistry and look at the human physiology, but you can't account for someone just force feeding themselves more delicious foods. And
Yeah, and then you ask why they do that, and
Yes.
again, this is beyond
It's a different
where.
topic. So yeah, okay, we'll leave that one there. I just wanted to throw that out because there is more to it. Or you can even have all the right information and eat the right foods and still have problems because people say, oh, I'm eating the right foods. I'm not eating any of the linoleic acid, blah, blah, blah.
Yes, one of the most
yeah.
one of the best things about my wife is that she points out to me when I'm wrong and says, you can't explain this or you can't explain that. It's completely true.
So
I'm so grateful I don't have all of the answers. It would be awful to have all of the answers.
Have all the answers and just see through the matrix and just see everything. Yeah.
I watched the Matrix last night.
Oh wow.
One.
That's cool. So
I'm afraid I've taken the red pill.
Yeah, a lot of people listening have taken the red pill. I've noticed there's a lot of people who see through the matrix in our crowd. Okay, so back to insulin resistance at a cellular level and insulin sensitivity. Let's recap that. Super interesting stuff. I'm gonna have to listen to this episode myself just to take in all the stuff you said. But why is it good to be insulin sensitive and insulin resistant at the cellular level at different times? And give us some like different examples too, or someone eating kind of a high fat, if they're in a ketogenic state, and what's going on.
Yeah. I came at this from ketogenic dieting, and there is absolutely no arguing that ketogenic dieting is perfectly okay and works better than any other dietary intervention I've ever come across. And without going into all of the nuts and bolts of the most basic biochemistry, you can say that there's very little generation of insulin from a very high fat diet. So on the carbohydrate insulin model, the most basic model, that's the one that gets stood up to be knocked down as a straw man, then at the most basic level, simply not having very much insulin around, you will increase lipolysis. If you increase lipolysis, again, David Ludwig, again, not with anybody can you ever agree with everything that they say, but David Ludwig did a very simple set of calculations where he worked out the energy content of, I think he looked at venous blood, but the arterial blood not going to be that different, and worked out how many calories were being supplied in the blood supply to the brain, and provided you are providing enough calories, if you keep out of addiction and trauma and all of the things which complicate this, then you can work out roughly how many calories there are in a ml of blood. And in fact, I've done a very similar back of the envelope calculation, and because I looked at fatty acids and looked at these great big long molecules, and you can end up with 3, 4, 5 times the level in the bloodstream that you would have had in normal, if you simply fasted for 60 hours. Yeah, so free fatty acid levels can go very, very high. And I worked out on the back of an envelope what the energy supply per ml of blood would be if you had free fatty acids of 2,000 millimoles per liter. And I then worked out, and glucose levels very, very low, as they would be when you're fasting. I then worked out if you were hypoglycemic, how many calories of energy you would have in your blood, because I was interested in what controls fatty acid oxidation, because there is a control of fatty acid oxidation within every individual cell, which does not require insulin. And it's, again, sorry to go back to the electron transport chain, it's probably in the electron transport chain. And I was interested in how you controlled fatty acid oxidation, so you simply didn't overload the cell with calories when you got to, and I wanted to know what the calorie supply was like. And it turns out that if you're mildly hypoglycemic, you're supplying exactly the same number of calories as if you're fasting and have elevated free fatty acids. And though the numbers look very different, one's at 2,000 millimoles per liter and the other's at 4.5 or 10 millimoles per liter. When you actually work out the number of ATP molecules that you could generate from either, they're about the same. And this to me, I was thinking, no, look at the numbers that changed with the fatty acids. This should have been way, way higher, and they're not. The body controls them very, very tightly. So I looked at that in terms of satiety and whether it could again, ignoring emotional behavioral issues, whether you could simply work it all out on the basis of how many calories were coming to the brain compared to on one diet versus another. How did we get started on this? I've forgotten.
We were talking about ketogenic diets, and
they produce enormous levels of free fatty acids, which in their own right will be satiating. So if you're in a ketogenic diet, it's highly, you're not hungry, and that was the thing that struck me most. And the rumors are, and I've never done fasting for more than 48 hours, but the rumors are that if you can get to fast for more than 3 or 4 days, then you stop being hungry. There are emotional problems from doing it, but you're not hungry. Ketogenic dieting, to me, the big thing was the sudden lacking hunger. But again, if you go back to Kevin Hall's work, he can do exactly the same with a high carbohydrate, high sucrose diet in human beings. And within 6 or 7 days, he can have people voluntarily eating less. So it doesn't have to be the ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet is the easiest way to do it. And I suspect that what all Kevin Hall's doing is cutting down linoleic acid. I was amazed that you could get that effect, assuming I'm correct that it is linoleic acid, within 4 or 5 days. I thought you'd have so much stored linoleic acid in your adipocytes that it would have taken much longer. But that's the only biochemical explanation I've got for why Kevin Hall gets the results he gets in his studies. And I think it's to do with linoleic acid, undoubtedly. I don't think he has the framework to view it in those terms, which is fair enough. It's not where he's come at it from. So I don't think he is into processed food versus unprocessed food. And I don't know whether he's into brain and satiety and things like that. And again, I'm much less enamored of that because, I look at particularly Kevin Hall does some of the best human studies in terms of comparisons. And we might not like him because he's Kevin Hall, and he has a very definite anti-low carbohydrate message to give, but his data are really useful. And I wouldn't go to him for insight, but I'd go to him for data. I don't think he's cooking the books in any way, shape, or form. I think he's very careful how he designs his studies, but ultimately he was very much into processed versus non-processed, I think. But I look at rodent studies, and some of the rodent ketogenic diets are so ultra processed, you would not believe it. I mean, pure extracted MCT oils mixed with casein, mixed with whatever else they want, butter fat, mixed with extracted butter fat, mixed with corn oil even. And these are ultra processed diets, but they don't budge the blood insulin levels. And that to me said that it doesn't matter what your dietary composition is or how ultra processed it is if it doesn't budge the insulin levels. And I come at these things from a biochemical point of view, and they don't budge the insulin levels at all. So that's a free pass for ultra processed, low carb ketogenic diets. Yeah.
Well, maybe in the short term, or maybe if people can actually not overeat or actually stick. I mean, yes. Yeah, but there's a lot of caveats.
This is why I like rodents, because rodents don't care what they look like. They're not going to go to the beach in a bikini. The rodent's going to eat till it's not hungry, and it's not got all of the baggage that we carry along with us in our heads, and it's not being bombarded by public health commercials. Yeah,
well, it's also not looking at their. Well, I don't know. Does it even look at their lifespan? Because you were talking about like adequate nutrients and protein, and I'm into that. Where I'm into your stuff with the just talking about the linoleic acid is specifically the problem, but I'm also into the idea of the process versus whole foods and getting the adequate nutrients and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's difficult with the rodent studies because they just stick a multivitamin in. But if it was that easy, people would be able to get slim by taking a multivitamin tablet, and it doesn't work. So and again, I'm asking to myself because, of course, obviously the PE diet that is doing rounds at the moment, I look at it and think, well, how does that fit in with the control of cellular satiety, or is this purely a a central nervous system effect? And if it is, what's monitoring it? How is it monitoring it? What does it decide the signal is to let you decide what to do? And I don't have answers to any of these things. They don't appear to come from basic biochemistry, or if they come from basic biochemistry, it's not a level that I can pull out of published papers. Yeah.
Wasn't it more based on the protein leverage hypothesis and
around
protein being satiated and nutrients? I mean, I prefer nutrients to energy instead of protein to energy.
How does your body detect what the level of flavin is in the diet? If you need flavin as precursor for flavin mononucleotide, or where does and again, there are other studies where if you make animals copper deficient and you give them access to 2 diets, they'll always choose the one with more copper in it. They know that they're doing it, but I don't have in my head a metabolic process that would allow us to understand what's going on there. So we were talking about keeping discussion high level. Up at the what you actually eat level, how the hell that works is a different matter altogether. And whether my presumption is almost all signaling within all cells comes down eventually to reactive oxygen species. That's the core marker. It happens with opioid signaling. It happens with vasopressin signaling. It's not just something to do with calories. And whether if you are eating a high saturated fat diet, whether that is what control. Now, I don't have the framework to work out why protein is satiating from a biochemical point of view. And this is my big bias, yeah? And I look at it as, well, it improves satiety, that's fine. But saying it improves satiety is looking at your brain as a black box. And looking at conditioning experiments and behavioral experiments, you can get so far by treating the human brain as a black box. You do this input and see what comes out. But ultimately, you have to try and understand what's going on. And I don't have the framework. And I have thought about this on and off for the last 6 months. How do you tell that you've had enough protein? I can tell.
Protein to me is just not even the same as an energy calorie.
No.
Fat and carbs are energy calories, and it's a different beast than a protein calorie.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Whether you're getting a signal from the liver, again, as you and I both know full well, that if you eat protein, that it will stimulate an insulin response, and whether that insulin is, but then how the body would differentiate between the insulin response from protein ingestion, amino acid ingestion, and how it would differentiate that from a protein from an insulin response to carbohydrate ingestion. It's a very, very interesting question to try and answer. And obviously on the slightly upper level, you can just say, well, okay, the protein produces glucagon release as well. But I don't think it's quite that simple. And I'm not sure whether you could then argue, well, the liver primarily deals with the protein load. And whether that is sending a neuronal signal to the brain through the vagus, because the liver carries a lot of information to the brain, but you're then into much, much higher levels than I've been able to get as far as I have gotten by thinking on a biochemical basis. And I struggle, again, we talked about this before, that you're interested in the higher level stuff. And I really, really struggle because I'm looking for an explanation on a biochemical basis, which means I'm going to miss a whole load of stuff on the high level basis. I completely accept that. I have no problem with that at all. But people need to come up with some sort of a mechanistic, rather than just observing that it happens and saying, well, that's great. Well, that's useful, isn't it? I mean, I think when Atkins came down with low carb diet, or even the people before Atkins and the people before them and the people before them, they all came up with low carbing works. And yeah, they had no mechanism. But I've gotten bogged down into looking for mechanisms, and I can't do that with the protein leverage hypothesis. I'm not saying it's wrong, and I have to say that I at one point I was looking to take under 10% of my calories as protein sourced, and I'm way above that now, probably over 20% of my calories as protein, and I don't worry about it. I was always worried about the insulin ILGF1, the growth hormone ILGF1 axis, in terms of, it's great, it builds muscles, but great, it builds cancer cells as well. So I was always concerned to keep protein counts low, to keep ILGF counts low, because most cancer cells sprout ILGF receptors on their surfaces. And my dad died of bowel cancer, so I wasn't particularly keen to follow him. But I worry about that less now because I'm still ketogenic. And if you're ketogenic, the low insulin levels that come with the ketosis block the conversion of growth hormone. They stop growth hormone producing insulin-like growth factor 1 in the liver. That conversion, when growth hormone hits the liver and says produce ILGF1, if insulin levels are low, that signal never happens. I keep meaning to measure my ILGF1 levels at some stage, because that would be quite nice to do, but I haven't got around to it yet.
Well, that's a good point too. Is just, I'm not scared of protein, and many people have talked about this before too. There's so much more context to it. Yeah, you don't want high IGF-1 levels, but most people in our world aren't eating 5 to 6 meals a day and constantly raising these things and eating all the carbs and constantly raising them like that. So the frequency and there's a lot more, like you said, that the context.
If you're 70 years old and you've got sarcopenia and you fall over, that's it. That's your end problem. You break your hip. That's very, very serious. So having a decent amount of muscle is really, really worth having. A mouse in a mouse box that lives there for the whole of its life and never falls off of anything because it lives on the ground on 4 legs, it probably doesn't care whether it gets osteoporosis when it gets older. It can still go on and win the Methuselah Prize for the longest living mouse, which is a growth hormone receptor knockout mouse. So that longevity is that's the prize winner.
I had Michael Rhodes on, Dr. Michael Rhodes, and talked about a lot of this Methuselah, his fruit flies and stuff. But anyway, so much more context too. Yeah, that's the problem with rodent studies. You say you're a fan of rodent studies, but then you just point out the problem with them is that it doesn't take that into consideration. So of course there's that. So running out of time here. So I guess maybe we could wrap back around to the repeat stuff a little. So now there's people, and I'm trying this in a sense where I'm eating the mostly animal-based diet. I'm kind of keto during the day, and then I have 2 meals, and then at night I am adding, say, the starch or the honey or something like that. So it's something like a carb cycling. I don't know if people have a name for it. This is just what I've decided is the best diet, and it seems fine because I'm not eating the linoleic acid, and I'm getting some starch, and I'm working out at night too. And so it seems like a cross between kind of an animal-based diet and a repeat type of thing, but it's still, what do you think about that?
I think there's a lot of scope for it. And there's a lot of scope for it. I think if you can get the linoleic acid out, I think the macros become less and less and less important. And again, you're talking about ketogenic dieting sidesteps the problem. But once you've got the linoleic acid out, you might well be able to eat a mixed diet and not have any problems. It then becomes a very much an open question in terms of whether there are specific advantages to being on the ketogenic end or being on the mixed diet end, or even going the extreme to the high carb end. I suspect from the signaling processes that the high carb end is probably not ideal. Mixed, you might have a trade-off between higher growth hormone levels, so more risk of cancer, versus lower growth hormone levels and more risk of fall and fracture. And keto, growth hormone levels or IGF-1 levels are usually going to be quite low on that. So, but it's a very open question where you should be on that spectrum. And I don't think we have the data to make a call on that.
I think it's super interesting because, is there a perfect diet is what I'm always interested in, or is there always a trade-off? And then with keto, the repeat crowd would say you're in this stress, you're putting your body in this stress state, and there's more cortisol, and there's all these other knocks against the keto. I see all the benefits, but are there, maybe I'll ask you that, are there some downsides maybe?
I've not been convinced by the downsides that people have brought up. And that's why at the moment I run. I don't think I'm out. For the first 15 years, I stayed on the edge of ketosis. That's where I ran, and I had some carbohydrate all the time. And I only really went fully ketogenic continuously probably 3 or 4 years ago, and I only went carnivore 2 years ago. And there were enough improvements health-wise that I couldn't go back. You've heard of the carnivore trap, that phrase?
I guess so.
Okay, no. There's a
I think so. But keep going.
28 days carnivore or 30 days carnivore, just see how you get on. Well, I didn't just do carnivore, I did the full Paleolithic ketogenic carnivore diet, the PKD from the people in Paleomedicina.
Yep.
And a number of niggly health problems that I didn't really think that I had went away, and they were noticeable by their absence. And that has made me extremely loath to go back to a mixed diet, because when I've introduced various parts of mixed diet that I fancy, particularly low back pain, and my low back pain is triggered by chocolate, particularly the only chocolate I've eaten has been 90% cocoa, high cocoa solids chocolate, and the back pain doesn't come back straight away. I have about a fortnight's grace, and then it niggles and niggles and gets worse and worse and worse. Then I injure it, and I've done the same with unprocessed coffee. I can do that with unprocessed coffee. So if I boil my coffee for 10 minutes, there's a chemical in the coffee which is a gut toxin, which is not heat stable, so you can boil the toxicity out of coffee. You keep the caffeine, and that's fine. But if I take unmodified coffee, it's about 10 days, 14 days, and the low back pain comes. So I've got this mark with low back pain, and I've put in various vegetables, and over the years, over the months, and they've triggered off low back pain as well. So I've decided really, I can usually get away with it 1 day a week, something like that. But if I start eating vegetables personally on a regular basis, then it's not doing my gut any good, and it's an inflammatory. Again, we could talk for hours on low back pain and what causes low back pain and how that's related to gut problems. And there's a whole load of biochemistry that's to do with that. It's not just randomly you get low back pain because you've got gut dysbiosis. But my gut doesn't seem to cope with vegetables terribly well. I have all of my life. I've had low back problems. And
have you tried fermented vegetables?
Yeah. Tried all these things.
Fruit though?
Long time since I've eaten any amount of fruit, so I don't know on that one. But the bottom line is that if I eat any significant amount of vegetables, then the low back pain comes back.
Well, and there's a lot of arguments that we shouldn't be eating vegetables. I stopped eating green vegetables a couple years ago, but I mean, I seem to do fine with some fermented vegetables and then just some, like avocado and different fruits. But if you try, so you haven't tried, have you tried honey?
Not any amount, no. Again, I'm fairly happy with what I'm doing at the moment. So I'm quite lazy. I get something that I'm familiar with and comfortable. And at the moment, I'm just eating beef, and it seems to work perfectly well. Beef and beef fat, and I'll have maybe the occasional root vegetable at the weekend if my wife cooks a proper Sunday dinner, which we don't do at this time of year because it's too hot. But I'll have a roast potato or something like that, but not any amount, and that I can get away with. But once I start with chocolate, then it's kind of I end up eating it on a very regular basis. Again, central, okay.
Well, there's a lot more to it. Exactly. No, I don't
get any weight.
Yeah, but I'm just wondering if this is a good long-term thing to do, because I do feel great. I understand, and people tell me about it all the time, but I just want to know, is this a good temporarily, or can you heal your gut, or is this based on other problems and we're blaming it?
My impression over the years is that we started off by excluding gluten. We then excluded most of the legume lectins. And I've now excluded vegetables, and the more you exclude them, the more they bite you when you bring them back in. There is a chronic long-term tolerance development.
Is that the trap kind of?
Yes.
The carb.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't, and I'm stuck basically. I'm not worried because I'm not a foodie. I like food. I like cooking. I cook quite a lot. I cook quite a lot of stuff that I don't eat now. Cooking for everybody else. But the problem is that once you've taken this out, there's a tolerance to immunological problem substances you eat. Like if you have people with the peanut allergy, if you desensitize them, you can keep giving them a tiny dose of oral peanuts again and again and again and again. If you don't stop, they're fine, and they can then eat a big dose of peanuts whenever they feel like. But if you desensitize them, stop giving them the little dose of peanuts, they will become resensitive, and when you take the big dose of peanuts, they'll have an anaphylaxis and need their EpiPen. So there is tolerance to toxic stuff that you eat by mouth that your immune system develops. And if you give it a complete rest and go to proper, what many of us would describe as the ancestral human diet, and you're eating basically mammoth fat with a bit of protein thrown in, then you become much less tolerant of introduced plant material. Now, whether that would have happened in the Paleolithic or whether that's a quirk of how we live our modern lives and the fact that I've probably still got some linoleic acid floating around in my adipocytes, I've no idea. But the carnivore trap is that you get into it, you feel really good, and whenever you start introducing anything else, you feel crap. And I could work at it. That honey is the one on my list, actually. I also still eat some dairy as well, so I'm not Paleolithic ketogenic anymore. So some dairy. And dairy and honey is quite a nice thought, actually. I might give that a go.
Try it, do your exercise. I say once a day. I'm not into like frequent, bouts of honey and all that stuff. But I mean, I just like the idea of once a day and doing it maybe around the workout and see what happens.
Yeah. It's worth a thought. I've got nothing against that. But I have found when I've tried to reintroduce vegetables, it's been a problem.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the problem, though. It's like there's so few people in the world. Well, I'm not even saying that really ancestral mammoth diet is the best. Maybe it is the best. It sounds like it's reasonable that we could live well on it. But I think there's so few people in the world like you that would just be happy to do it. Yes. That we need to find some kind of compromise. I don't want to say balance. Balance is such a loaded term. But I'm not saying eat a balanced diet. But there is some sort of thing where let people live a little.
If you could get rid of the vegetable oils, then you have the potential for feeding the world on a starch source plus a reasonable protein source becomes much, much easier if you're not having to try and find enormous amounts of animal-based products in terms of trying to feed everybody.
Well, that's what I've seen. So traveling around the world and talking to different people from different cultures, it's animal foods and fat and starch, and or fruits, whatever, some sort of starchy fruit, but it's not tons of vegetables and it's not tons of linoleic acid. So that's what I've seen in Peru. Yeah, everywhere. They're just like, they eat meat and potatoes. Meat and potatoes is fine.
It's completely understandable. Yeah.
Without the seed oils. Yeah.
Yeah, it's comprehensible, and as I say, I comment. My ideas are but they are anti-low carb. It's not as simple as carbohydrate, and the concept of being able to use a mixed diet is interesting to say the least. I happen to like what I do, and I'm not expecting to change it in any significant way soon, just because I've got my own personal trap. And again, my wife, who's my anchor that keeps me from being too airy-fairy, says, no way is she going to try carnivore. No way, full stop.
That's no. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not for everyone, I'll tell you that.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate that.
Yeah, well, it's great. I think we've gotten some good stuff today. It kind of makes sense in the world. Like, I'm just kind of trying to bring it to the worldwide scale. Like I was saying, visiting different populations, being in Africa, eating meat and fruit and feeling great. And everyone there seemed very healthy. They, unless they were malnourished, there was a slight, I didn't see a lot of that. That was very rare. Why? I didn't go to certain parts of Africa, maybe where they do have that. But they didn't have the obesity unless they had the seed oil. So I talked about this a lot in Uganda, they had all the seed oils. They're eating all the whole foods, but they had the seed oils in. And then the ladies in their 40s and 50s were very big. And I think that's what's going on. But what I'm saying is, once you look at it from this perspective of maybe the main problems are the seed oils and this high linoleic acid, and even the green vegetable part. I mean, I don't have a huge problem with green vegetables, although I cut them out. There could be a problem with, or different kinds of legumes, or, with the different lectins and oxalates, and people know about all these anti-nutrients by now. I'm just saying, at a worldwide level, if starch and fruit and honey could be fine, animal fat and meat is all fine.
Yeah.
Some version of that seems to work universally throughout time. Now,
I see that potential. Yes. I would agree.
Some combination, just get rid of the seed oils, and I mean the highly refined foods too. I mean, there's
No, I can see that. That's very definitely the case.
Okay, we did it. Thanks so much. Where's your blog? What is it called? And how
it's
do people find
Hyperlipid. Hyperlipid. If you just DuckDuckGo, I don't suppose Google will bring it up anymore, but DuckDuckGo does.
Mm-hmm.
So it's there, and it's long and rambling. So
that's great. And you don't have anything else going on. You're not. You just do this as a hobby. You're not promoting anything. You're not.
No. I work 2 days a week as a surgeon. So that's all I do.
I love it. You got nothing to promote. You got no social media. You just write your blog. You do your surgery.
I have no choice about writing the blog. I have no choice at all. These are just ideas that come to me. And if an idea doesn't gel, I won't blog about it. I've got 3 or 4 ideas I want to blog about, but they're not set. So it's the Hyperlipid is what it's called, because I'm always been a long-term high-fat person. Okay.
Well,
it's been great
thanks
talking.
so much for what you do, and thanks for the interview, and maybe we'll check in at some point in the future.
It's been lovely talking. Thanks very much. Okay.
All right. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sharing with a friend. Thanks for giving a review on iTunes or the Apple Podcast app. Go to nosetotail.org for that grass-fed, grass-finished meat, the seasonings, the body care, the biltong. Get your salt from Redmond. Use the code SAPIEN for 15% off, and go to sapien.org to join the tribe or be part of our program. Our program is for anyone worldwide. 12-week class, videos. We have a health coach, personal health call for you. Check it out, sapien.org, and we'll see you next week with another great episode.